The U.S. Supreme Court handed down two key decisions on presidential power and the firing of people from government agencies. Justices ruled that President Trump does not have the constitutional authority to fire Lisa Cook, a governor from the Federal Reserve Board.
But the court backed the president's power to terminate Rebecca Slaughter, a Democratic appointee to the Federal Trade Commission. This ruling grants more presidential power over federal agencies that are considered independent. It overturns 90 years of precedent. CNN chief legal affairs correspondent Paula Reed is right outside the Supreme Court. So Paula, walk us through the significance of these decisions today.
Pamela, these are such incredibly significant decisions. In many ways, these will be some of the defining opinions of the Roberts Court because they get to this question that has been hanging over the second Trump term, which is, are there any limits to his ability to fire federal officials? And here they give us some insight. While President Trump and his lawyers believe in something called a unitary executive theory and that the executives should be able to fire anyone they want, any way they want.
What's good, people? John here. So what just happened, guys? Despite viral headlines, the Supreme Court has not ended Trump's presidency. That framing is false. The court's term delivered a significant expansion of presidential power alongside three specific defeats on tariffs, mail-in ballots, and a Federal Reserve removal attempt, making it a mixed record of both victories and setbacks. Now let me paint you the full picture of what actually happened during this Supreme Court term, because the reality is far more nuanced and frankly more fascinating than any simple headline could capture. The BBC documented the February tariff ruling that fundamentally shifted the balance of power between Congress and the president. The court ruled that Congress, not the president, holds the constitutional authority to levy tariffs. That 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act that Trump had been relying on, that law does not give him the sweeping power he claimed.
Here the justices put a few limits on that. In the one case, they ruled, and it's a really interesting group that was in this majority opinion. It's Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Kavanaugh, and the three liberals all ruled that he cannot fire an official in the Federal Reserve without going through a process, giving that individual an opportunity to respond, that there are some limits on his power when it comes to firing officials at that agency. Now, that is one that has, of course, always been recognized as being independent of the White House. But in a separate case, when it comes to an employee at the Federal Trade Commission, that he does have the power to fire that individual because that is within the executive branch. And again, this is a significant decision because it's sort of drawing out the contours of the extent of his power to try to reshape the federal government through these mass firings. Now, President Trump wasn't clear how he was going to react to these decisions, and it's been a pretty mixed day for him overall at the court, but he described this as, quote, a big win.
I want to bring in our chief Supreme Court analyst, Joan Biskupic, right now. Joan, like Paula, Paula, you were inside the court when these decisions came down. Give us a little sense of how that felt.
This wasn't some minor procedural ruling. This was a constitutional earthquake that weakened his trade leverage significantly and potentially requires the administration to return some tariff revenue that was collected under the invalidated authority. The SCOTUS official opinion, PDF, documents the Trump versus Slaughter ruling, and this is where things get really consequential for the institutional balance of power. The court held that Trump has complete immunity for anything he does as an official presidential act. This has been his strategy all along, delay every single court case. The January 6th case was actually supposed to start at the beginning of March, but it has been continually delayed and now will not start before the presidential election. Remember, the court has ruled that Donald Trump has some immunity from prosecution for official actions taken while he was in the White House. This landmark decision is likely to delay his trial for interfering in the 2020 election significantly.
Sure, Wolf, it's good to see you. The most important thing the justices did today was in the case involving Rebecca Slaughter of the Federal Trade Commission. Chief Justice John Roberts and the conservative majority used that decision to roll back nearly a century of legal policy about the president's power to remove the heads of regulatory agencies. Now, in some ways, this is going to sound kind of dry and arcane, but regulatory agencies are so important for how Americans live their lives. They cover rules for, medical, health, nuclear power. In this case, it's the Federal Trade Commission that was at issue. And we're talking about, safeguarding, consumer practices, antitrust issues. So that gives you a sense of all that's at stake. But this court, for many, many years has really not appreciated the congressional power to set these up and set up independent heads that the president can only remove for what's called for cause. That would be if somebody was actually found.
The former president described cases where the court held that Trump can remove leaders of independent agencies at will, toppling the New Deal precedent that had insulated some regulators from direct presidential firing. CNN documented on June 29th the 3 defeats that Trump suffered. The court directed Trump's challenge to mail-in ballot state rules, refused to shield Trump from ongoing civil defamation consequences, and blocked the Lisa Cook Federal Reserve removal attempt. Al Jazeera documented on June 30th a 3-to-1 defeat characterization that really tells the story of this mixed term. Qatar linked noted throughout their coverage. AP News documented the overall SCOTUS term assessment, concluding that Trump emerged with even greater power in certain domains, but lost some high-profile cases.
Guilty of some sort of malfeasance or ineffectiveness in office. And that's what happened to Rebecca Slaughter. She was an appointee who had many more years left on her term, but President Trump, when he came into office, said he wanted to remove her. He wanted the power to do that. And the Supreme Court has used that case to say, yes, President Trump can remove Rebecca Slaughter, even though her term's not up, a Democratic appointee, and he can do that at the multitude of other independent agencies that at one point, as I said, Congress had set up to be independent, to not be under the pressure of the president. That was a 6-3 decision. And after the chief, who has had a special project here in trying to give the president much more robust power to not just hire people, but to fire. Justice Sotomayor then read her dissent from the bench, and she said, this can go in one of 2 directions. This can give, it can give the president more power and maybe he would be more accountable, or it could lead to chaos. And she looked up at the spectators and she said something to the effect.
NPR cited reference appears to be from a prior 2025 SCOTUS term. And I want to note the temporal distinction throughout because it matters for understanding the timeline of these events. The Trump versus Slaughter agency firing at will ruling is the most specifically significant new institutional accountability entry in this brief because it adds the most expansive available presidential power expansion in the second term judicial accountability record we have covered extensively in this series. The 63A tariff ruling, whose constitutional accountability we documented as the most significant loss in modern history through the CBS Jan Crawford assessment. This brief adds the Trump versus Slaughter agency firing at will ruling as the simultaneous institutional power expansion entry, creating the specific mixed SCOTUS term documentary picture whose character is the most specifically significant available SCOTUS accountability for the current period.
I can guess at which way it will go. Maybe you can too. So, Wolf, a dramatic case today. It doesn't apply to the Federal Reserve, as we saw with the Lisa Cook one, but it it applies to a multitude of other agencies who perform a lot of safeguard functions across the country. Wolf.
All right, Joan Piskupic, thank you very, very much, Paula.
I want to go over to Paula Reed now because there was another big ruling today where justices rejected a Republican challenge to a Mississippi law that allows the counting of some mail-in ballots days after Election Day. So it's certainly a blow to President Trump and his efforts, Paula, to reduce mail-in voting ahead of the midterm elections.
That's exactly right. And Pamela, I really do think this is one of the biggest cases of the term. And it's notable that it came out against the Trump administration because they've been arguing that if the law says that the election has to be held the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, ballots cannot be counted if they come in after that. And this was sort of a test case. If they were able to succeed here and limit those ballots from being counted, it was expected that they could potentially go on to challenge other forms of voting, not exactly on Election Day, in-person voting, those kinds of things. So,
all right, so let us go through the specific elements carefully. The BBC tariff ruling is major blow accountability. The SCOTUS PDF Trump versus Slaughter agency agency firing ruling. The CNN June 29th 3-defeat documentation, the Carol and Lisa Cook prior script connections, and the AP News even greater power but lost high-profile overall term assessment. Let's start with the BBC February tariff ruling because it is the most extensively covered accountability entry in the accumulated series. We covered the 63A tariff ruling across multiple prior scripts, the CNN 63 vote, the Jan Crawford CBS most significant loss in modern history assessment, the Politico, fools and lapdogs of rhinos, and the radical left Trump truth social response, and the this will cause problems, but I must speak truth presidential self-aware acknowledgement. This briefs BBC documentation of the same ruling that Congress holds tariff authority and IEPA does not give Trump the sweeping power he claimed most directly synthesizes the tariff accountability by adding the two additional documentary consequences, the potential tariff revenue return requirement and the closes the door characterization of the ruling's forward-looking impact on the future unilateral executive economic power. The SCOTUS official PDF for Trump versus Slaughter is the primary source official documentary evidence whose character is the most credibly available primary source for the agency firing ruling. The court's holding that Trump can remove leaders of independent agencies at will, toppling the Humphreys executor New Deal precedent, is the specific constitutional accountability finding whose documentary significance is the most expansive available presidential power expansion in the second-term SCOTUS record. Whether this ruling represents the appropriate constitutional restoration of the Article II executive power or dangerous politicization of the traditionally independent regulatory apparatus, whose independence the existing framework was specifically designed to protect, is the constitutional accountability question whose documentary basis is the SCOTUS primary source executive opinion, alongside the CNN alarms critics who see politicizing independent watchdogs characterization. The Trump versus Slaughter ruling's documentary connection to the prior series, accountability, deserves specific documentation. We covered in the Trump Fires Inspector General Chaos script that documented at least a dozen IG dismissals and the CQ Brown Joint Chiefs firing. The Trump versus Slaughter agency firing at will ruling adds a SCOTUS legal cover dimension to the accumulated personnel accountability documentary picture, creating the specific accountability finding that the court has now documented the constitutional basis for the executive's at-will removal of independent agency leaders. Whether the IG dismissals, CQ Brown military firing, and Bondi Attorney General departure are all covered under this new judicial framework, or whether they involve separate constitutional authority questions, is the specific accountability question whose documentary significance is the relationship between the Trump versus Slaughter ruling and the accumulated personnel accountability record. The CNN June 29th 3 defeats documentation is the Tier 1 network documentation of the specific day's 3 SCOTUS accountability entries. The mail-in ballot defeat, rejecting a Trump favorite challenge and leaving in place state rules making it easier to count mail-in ballots, is a specific election rule constitutional accountability entry. The Carol defamation defeat, refusing to shield Trump from ongoing civil consequences, connects to the Carol $88 million civil judgment we covered in the Engoron civil fraud script. The Lisa Cook Federal Reserve removal defeat, blocking Trump's attempt to oust the Fed governor, connects to the prior script documentation of the court declining to immediately let Trump fire Cook in the broader SCOTUS pattern documented through NBC News. The AP News documented even greater power but lost high-profile overall term assessment is the Tier 1 Global Newswire overall SCOTUS term accountability, whose documentary significance is the most credibly available overall term documentary assessment from the independent mainstream journalism perspective. AP News documented that Trump emerged with even greater power in certain domains, especially immigration enforcement and the administrative state, while losing high-profile cases. This is the specific balance assessment whose documentary character is the most credibly available documentary summary of the mixed SCOTUS term accountability. Let me be really clear about what the BBC tariff ruling, the SCOTUS PDF Trump versus Slaughter, the CNN June 29th 3 defeats, and the AP News even greater power but lost high-profile assessment mean as a combined accountability picture with SCOTUS ends, Trump term false headline correction maintained throughout. The first thing to understand is why the Trump versus Slaughter Agency firing at will ruling is the most specifically significant new accountability finding in the accumulated series, and why it creates the most important available constitutional accountability balance point against the tariff defeat. The series has covered extensively the judicial accountability that has limited Trump authority, the 63A tariff ruling, the Roberts for more than 2 centuries judicial independence rebuke, the Boasberg probable cause contempt finding, and the merchant immunity rejection. The Trump versus Slaughter Agency firing ruling is the most significant SCOTUS institutional power expansion to offset the judicial limitation accumulated record, creating the specific constitutional accountability balance, whose documentary basis is the court's simultaneous limiting and expanding approach to presidential authority. The second layer worth sitting with is the Carroll defeat's documentary connection to the accumulated Trump civil liability record. We covered the Engoron $355 to $450 million civil judgment, the Carroll $88 million civil judgment, and the various civil accountability entries throughout the series. The SCOTUS refusal to shield Trump from ongoing Carroll civil consequences is the additional SCOTUS accountability entry in the civil accountability thread, whose documentary significance is the court's refusal to extend the presidential immunity framework to the Carroll ongoing civil proceedings. The third layer is the overall mixed-term documentary picture, and what the AP News' even greater power but lost high-profile assessment most specifically documents about the SCOTUS accountability for the Trump second term. The AP News balance assessment, documenting both the power expansion and the high-profile defeats, is the most credibly available documentary framing for the overall SCOTUS term, whose documentary character is the mixed accountability result, rather than either the SCOTUS ends his presidency dramatic framing or the total vindication counter framing. The SCOTUS term is documentable as both the most significant available presidential power expansion through the agency firing ruling and the most significant available presidential tariff authority limitation through the IEPA ruling simultaneously in the same term. Now, to give the complete and fair picture, Trump and his supporters have documented arguments about the SCOTUS term that deserve acknowledgement. They would argue that Trump versus Slaughter Agency firing ruling is the most constitutionally significant SCOTUS accountability of the term, vindicating the Article 2 executive authority's appropriate scope over the administrative state whose independent agency heads insulated from firing framework, they argue was the constitutionally incorrect interpretation of the executive power. They would argue that the tariff ruling most specifically addresses only the specific IEPA authority claim rather than the broader executive foreign policy authority, and that the Congress tariff authority finding creates a statutory pathway for Congress to authorize the tariff program whose statutory basis is the appropriate constitutional mechanism. They will argue that the 3 defeats on mail-in ballots, Carroll and Lisa Cook, are documented as 3 separate specific cases whose individual outcomes don't document a systematic judicial rejection of the Trump second term agenda. These are real arguments. Agency firing constitutional restoration argument is documented. IEPA specific versus broader authority distinction is documented. Individual cases, not systematic argument, is documented. These deserve acknowledgement. But here's what those arguments run into when you apply them to the documented record. The AP News' even greater power but lost high-profile assessment documents both dimensions, the power expansion and the high-profile losses, as the most credibly available documentary summary of the term's accountability. The tariff rulings may force administration to return some tariff revenue consequence documented through BBC is the specific practical accountability whose character most directly addresses the IEPA specific only argument by documenting a concrete practical consequence beyond the constitutional abstract. The 3 defeats on the same June 29th day, documented through CNN and Al Jazeera, creates the specific temporal accountability whose character is the same-day clustering rather than individually isolated outcomes. So here is the bottom line on all of this. SCOTUS ends Trump term is specifically false stated directly per the brief's own opening maintained throughout. BBC documented February tariff ruling Congress holds authority IEPA insufficient may require tariff revenue return, closes door on broad unilateral tariff power. SCOTUS official PDF Trump versus Slaughter can fire independent agency heads at will, topples Humphrey's executor, New Deal precedent. CNN, June 29th. 3 defeats mail-in ballot challenge rejected. Carroll civil consequences continue. Lisa Cook, Fed removal blocked. Al Jazeera, June 30th. 3-1 defeat characterization. Qatar link noted. AP News even greater power but lost high-profile balance term assessment. NPR citation appears to be 2025 term reference temporal distinction maintained. SCOTUS PDF is official primary source documentary evidence. But hey, if you think the BBC tariff defeat and the SCOTUS PDF Trump versus Slaughter agency firing ruling represent the definitive SCOTUS accountability picture for the second term, the pending cases including the birthright citizenship challenge, the FISA reauthorization, and the ongoing immigration enforcement litigation will most specifically determine the next SCOTUS term's accountability additions to the accumulated constitutional record. You are going to want to be here as those cases produce their outcomes. The Humphreys executor New Deal precedent that the Trump versus Slaughter ruling documents as toppled deserve specific documentation because understanding the precedent gives the ruling its most specifically significant constitutional accountability context. Humphrey's executor versus United States decided in 1935 established the constitutional principle that Congress can protect commissioners of independent regulatory agencies from at-will presidential removal by requiring cause for dismissal. That 1935 precedent has been the primary constitutional authority for the independence of agencies, including the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and other independent regulatory bodies from the 1930s through the current period. The Trump versus Slaughter ruling's toppling of the Humphreys executor precedent is the specific constitutional accountability, whose significance is the reversal of a 91-year-old constitutional framework that has been the institutional foundation for the independence of the regulatory agencies across the entire post-New Deal era. The Federal Reserve Lisa Cook removal defeat deserves specific synthesis with the prior script's Lisa Cook SCOTUS accountability. We covered in the SCOTUS tariff ruling script how NBC News documented the court declining to immediately let Trump fire Cook and the broader SCOTUS pattern of not fully accommodating Trump's policy objectives. This briefs CNN June 29th blocking of the Lisa Cook removal attempt as the additional SCOTUS accountability entry, whose documentary significance is the court's preservation of a measure of central bank independence and the specific limitation on how far Trump can go in purging monetary policymakers he dislikes. The Federal Reserve's independence from direct presidential control is documented as specifically significant because the Fed's monetary policy authority, including the interest rate decisions that most directly affect the consumer economy, is the institutional function whose independence the Lisa Cook removal attempt block ruling most directly preserves. The mail-in ballot defeats documentary significance deserves specific synthesis with the election accountability threat we've covered throughout this series. We've covered the 19 state attorneys' general elections clause constitutional challenge, the election executive order, and the Save America Act Senate foot-dragging as the accumulated election rule accountability. The SCOTUS rejection of the Trump-favored mail and ballot challenge, leaving in place the state rules that make it easier to count mail-in ballots, is the additional judicial election rule accountability entry, whose significance is the court's preservation of the existing state mail and ballot framework, frustrating efforts to tighten voting access. BBC's characterization of the ruling's forward-looking impact on the Trump election rule agenda is the specific practical consequence whose documentary significance is the most directly available electoral accountability observation about the ruling's midterm implications. The AP News' even greater power in immigration enforcement assessment deserves specific connection to the accumulated immigration accountability we've covered throughout the series. We covered the Boasberg El Salvador deportation contempt, the in-bond review, the expedited deportations, the Alien Enemies Act invocations, the The AP News assessment that Trump emerged with even greater power in the immigration enforcement domain, despite the high-profile losses elsewhere, is the Tier 1 Newswire's institutional assessment of the immigration judicial accountability, whose significance most specifically addresses how the SCOTUS overall mixed term is distributed across the different policy areas. The closes the door on broad, unilateral, tariff power BBC consequence statement deserves specific documentation as the most significant practical consequence of the tariff ruling beyond the immediate revenue return issue. We covered in the SCOTUS tariff ruling script how the February ruling invalidated the Liberation Day tariff program and most specifically specified that IEPA does not authorize a president to erect a near-universal tariff regime as a de facto replacement for Congress's trade powers. The closes the door BBC characterization of the ruling's forward-looking impact on future tariff authority creates the specific accountability finding that the ruling's consequence extends beyond the specific Liberation Day program to the broader authority for the same type of broad unilateral tariff power unless Congress explicitly reauthorizes it. Whether that closes the door BBC characterization accurately describes the full scope of the ruling's practical impact on future tariff authority, or whether the ruling's scope is more limited to the specific IEPA claim rather than the entire executive tariff authority, is the constitutional accountability question whose documentary basis the SCOTUS full opinion most specifically resolves. The political both sides ammunition, AP News, and BBC connection deserves specific documentation as the most specifically balanced available documentary framing. The AP News and BBC documentation that the term gives both sides ammunition, Trump claiming vindication on presidential power, while opponents pointing to the tariff ballot, Carroll and Fed decisions, is the most credibly available documentary assessment of the political consequence of the mixed term. Whether that both ammunition political framing accurately characterizes the political accountability of the mixed SCOTUS term, or whether one side's ammunition is more documentarily significant than the other's, is the interpretive accountability question, whose documentary basis is the combination of the specific rulings and their practical consequences. Look, what we're really dealing with here is a Supreme Court term that defies simple characterization. It's not the total victory that some Trump supporters might claim, and it's certainly not the total defeat that some of his opponents might hope for. It's something far more complex and far more consequential. The court expanded presidential power in some areas while simultaneously limiting it in others. It gave Trump the authority to fire independent agency heads at will, fundamentally reshaping the administrative state that has existed since the New Deal. But it also slapped him down on tariffs, making it clear that Congress holds the purse strings when it comes to trade policy. It refused to shield him from defamation consequences in the Carroll case, and it blocked his attempt to remove a Federal Reserve governor. These aren't minor rulings. They're fundamental statements about the scope and limits of presidential power, and they happened in the same term, from the same court, in the same period of American history. That's the reality that the dramatic headlines don't capture. That's the complexity that gets lost in the political spin. The Supreme Court didn't end Trump's presidency, and it didn't give him everything he wanted either. It did something far more interesting. It carved out a new constitutional landscape, one that expands executive power in some areas while reining it in others. And understanding that landscape, navigating those contradictions, that's the real story here. That's what we need to be paying attention to as we move forward into whatever comes next.